AITA for cutting off financial support after my granddaughter warned me about her father? My name is Frank Miller. I am 68 years old, and for the last 7 winters, my only mission has been to keep the wreckage that is my family standing. That implies that every other Saturday without fail, I pick up Mia to go to Washington Park. We sit near the pond or under the protective shade of a majestic oak tree to fulfill our ritual. A vanilla ice cream for me and a strawberry one for her. It is our little bubble of peace since Anna left. Anna was my whole life. 7 years ago, the state troopers knocked on my door to tell me that her car had gone off the road on a dark stretch of the interstate. They said the impact was brutal, that the vehicle caught fire almost instantly. The coroner was categorical. The body was too unrecognizable for an open casket. They handed us a brass urn with what supposedly remained of her after the fire. We cremated her on the recommendation of Scott, my son-in-law, without the strength to question anything. 6 months later, Helen went with her. The doctors spoke of cardiorespiratory arrest, but in the neighborhood, we all knew the truth. She died of sadness. Losing Anna tore out her soul, and her heart simply decided it wasn't worth beating in such an empty world. So now only Mia, Scott, and I remain. My son-in-law is supposed to raise the girl alone, and I finance that loneliness. Those $30,000 a year are the toll I pay to keep the promise I made to Anna that her daughter would never lack anything. It is what family does, or that is what I repeated to myself, so as not to feel like an ATM. That September afternoon in Washington Park, the late summer heat was beginning to let up. Mia was next to me on our usual bench, moving her light-up sneakers and telling me enthusiastically that she had gotten an A on her last language arts exam. "You're a whiz, kiddo," I told her, squeezing her shoulder with pride. She returned a smile identical to the one Anna used to give me, and for a fleeting instant, the pain seemed like a distant shadow, but then her expression withered. "Grandpa," she whispered, lowering her voice so much that I could barely hear her over the rustle of the leaves. She looked nervously toward the playground area, making sure no one was listening, and pressed herself against my side. "Please, stop sending money to Dad." I froze. The air became heavy. "What are you saying, kiddo? Why do you say that?" "The January money. Don't give it to him anymore." Her little hand grabbed the sleeve of my cardigan, and I saw something in her eyes that churned my insides. A liquid fear improper for a 7-year-old girl. "Please, stop. You have to watch him, Grandpa. There is something you have to see." My chest hurt as if a hot nail were being driven into me. "Mia, look at me. What is happening at home? Does Scott treat you well?" "Just watch him," she repeated, jumping off the bench suddenly as if she had said something forbidden. "I have to go now. If we get home late, he'll get in a bad mood, and I don't want him to get angry." The drive to the house in the suburbs was a sepulchral silence only broken by the click-clack of the turn signal. Mia hugged her backpack against her chest, looking out the window with her gaze lost in the subdivisions. Scott lives in a townhouse we bought 4 years ago thanks to a check I signed without blinking. A house with beige vinyl siding and dark blinds that always seems too closed, too dark. He was waiting for us on the porch, checking his watch impatiently. "You're late," he blurted out without even a hello. There was a traffic jam on the expressway. I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. Mia got out of the car with her head down and passed by her father like a breath, seeking refuge inside. Scott neither touched her nor asked how her day was. "Go in and get on with your math homework," he ordered dryly. I stood there on the sidewalk, watching through the large bay window as my granddaughter sat at the dining table with the rigidity of a soldier. Scott walked behind her talking on his cell phone, ignoring her existence completely. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. "Scott," I called him before he closed the door. "Is everything okay?" I noticed Mia was very strange today. He shrugged with that indifference that had always bothered me, but which I justified as his way of dealing with grief. "It's age stuff, Frank. Kids have their streaks." He paused, leaning against the doorframe, and looked at me with a new intensity. "By the way, would there be any possibility that you advance this year's payment? Some unforeseen expenses have come up with the roof renovation and some pending bills." "Advance it. It's September, Scott. There are 4 months left until January. What kind of expenses are so urgent? You know what it's like to maintain a house of this size alone," he replied, avoiding my gaze. "But forget it. If it can't be done, it can't be done. See you next Saturday." The door closed with a dry slam. I returned to my car and sat there with the engine running, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind was a hive of activity. Watch him. $45,000 a year. Although this year I intended to cut back to $30,000, he was still expecting the high figure. In 7 years, I had given him a fortune. It was too much money for a man who couldn't dedicate even a glance of affection to his own daughter. I drove back to my house in the city center while the sky was dyed a violent violet. My home received me with that dense silence that settled in the day Helen left. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I reach out toward her side of the bed, forgetting for a second that I will only find cold sheets. That night it was impossible to sleep. I went over every one of our uncomfortable dinners. Every time Scott asked for money, but never invited me past the living room. The night the world stopped. I simply couldn't believe it. It was March 15th, 2017. 2 state troopers, with their impeccable uniforms and that rigidity imposed by years of service, called at my door at 3 in the morning. Their faces maintained that almost freezing professional neutrality, which is rehearsed for the exact moment when you are going to destroy someone's universe. I remember thinking that the street in the heart of the city was too quiet, too indifferent to the catastrophe that was about to enter my living room. "There has been an accident on the highway," the older one said, lowering his eyes for barely a second. "Your daughter's vehicle went off the road near the junction." Vehicle. He used that skeptical, bureaucratic word. He didn't say Anna's car, nor the red sedan that you helped her buy. He said vehicle, as if the semantic distance could cushion the blow of what came next. "Is she in the hospital?" "At Lakeview General?" I asked, groping blindly for my jacket. Helen was behind me, squeezing my arm so hard that her nails dug into my skin. The trooper shook his head with unbearable slowness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. There was a structural fire after the impact. Your son-in-law has already been there." He identified her through dental records that he provided himself. It was at that precise instant when Helen's knees buckled and the air left our house never to return. The details arrived in dribs and drabs like acid on an open wound. Anna was coming back late from dinner at the house of Natalie, her best friend from college. They said the car lost control, crashed against a concrete pillar, and became a funeral pyre in a matter of seconds. By the time the firefighters arrived, the metal was a black tangle, and the interior held nothing that could be recognized. She died instantly. She didn't suffer or know what happened. Those are the white lies that the system has prepared for those of us left here, orphaned of children. The funeral was with a closed and sealed casket. It had to be that way, they told us. Scott remained by my side throughout the service, holding Mia in his arms. The little one was barely 6 months old. She was a bundle of white blankets who didn't understand why her grandfather was crying with that dull sound. I remember thinking how cruel fate was. That baby would never have a single clear memory of her mother's face, nor the echo of her laugh, nor the smell of her perfume. Days later they handed us a simple brass urn, cold and heavy. It was on our fireplace mantel for a whole week before Helen was able to get within a meter of it. "We should take it to Clearwater Lake," she said one morning with a hollow voice that seemed to come from another room. "Do you remember how happy she was there?" How could I not remember? We spent every summer of her childhood in those waters. There Anna learned to swim without floaties. There she caught her first fish with a cane pole that I made myself. And there, under the old wooden pier, she gave her first teenage kiss. Helen was right. That was her place in the world. But then Helen also broke. 6 months after we buried our daughter, my wife's heart simply gave up. The doctors spoke of cardiomyopathy, a sudden cardiac arrest. But I knew the real autopsy. She died of grief. I witnessed her daily erosion. She became thinner, quieter, more transparent, until one autumn morning I woke up and her side of the bed was at peace. I found her in the kitchen collapsed next to the coffee maker, the same one Anna had given us for Christmas 3 years earlier. After that, I lost the will. I couldn't force myself to go to the lake, alone. I couldn't let go of that brass urn. I felt that if I scattered the ashes, I would lose the last gram of matter that connected me to my daughter, and I had already lost too much. So the urn stayed there presiding over my solitude for 7 years. Until today, my store, Miller's Market, was the only thing that kept my head above water. It is a business that has been in my family since 1989. My father founded it, and I took over when he decided he had cut enough meat and weighed enough produce. It is not a luxury place. It is a neighborhood store on a strategic corner near Main Street, one of those where the floor creaks and the air smells of deli meat, sharp cheddar, and freshly ground coffee. It is the kind of place where people still call you by your name. And although most use credit cards, the older ones still pay me with counted coins and folded bills. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Anna. Everyone came to the funeral. After Helen's death, the store became my bunker. I opened at 6 in the morning, restocked shelves with obsessive precision, checked out the regular customers, and didn't close until 8 in the evening. The routine was my anesthesia. It kept me from thinking too much about the empty house and the photos on the walls that would no longer move. And above all, I kept my promise. Shortly before the accident, at one of our last dinners, Anna made me swear half-jokingly that if anything ever happened to her, I would ensure that Mia lacked nothing. And I did it amply. $30,000 that Scott always tried to stretch to $45,000 with excuses of private schools and doctors flew from my account to his every January. It wasn't for the money. It was to keep my daughter's memory alive and ensure her little one had the future that was stolen from her. But Mia's words in the park yesterday have opened a crack in my armor. Grandpa, stop sending him money. There is something you have to see. That night, I stood planted in front of Anna's urn in the gloom of the living room. For 7 years, I have venerated it as a sacred object. What if something was terribly wrong? What if my 7-year-old granddaughter has seen a truth that my tired eyes refuse to accept? I started to go over the accident detail by detail. Anna was driving on a road she took daily, a night without rain, without traffic. How could she lose control so absolutely? How could the fire be so selective to wipe her off the map, but leave intact the records that Scott conveniently provided? I never questioned Scott. He was her husband, the father of my granddaughter. He was supposed to love her, and I was too busy drowning in my own mourning to suspect. But now with Mia's terrified whisper vibrating in my ears, the question has started to burn inside me. What the hell have I really been paying for during these 7 years? The woman who would change everything entered my life on a Tuesday morning, just when the sun was beginning to warm the asphalt of Main Street. The days following Mia's warning in the park had been a torture of nerves and lack of sleep. I did my usual tasks, but my thoughts returned to her small voice again and again. Watch him. And I tried. I passed by Scott's house twice when closing the store. I parked down the street like an old fool who has lost his mind and stared at the lowered blinds. Nothing seemed out of place, just a man going to his office, coming home, living his life as an exemplary widower. I started to think they were figments of my imagination or perhaps tales of a girl with too much imagination. Tuesdays at Miller's Market are predictable, and in that routine, I found my only comfort. Mrs. Thompson comes around 7 for her herbal tea and shortbread cookies. Old Mr. Harris arrives at 8, punctual as a clock, for his lottery tickets and to complain about his Social Security. At 9, there is a small hustle of rushed office workers grabbing coffee and some bagels before going into work. I know their steps, their quirks, their favorite brands. It is a human map that I know by heart. But that woman entered at 9:15 and broke the map. I noticed her immediately because she wasn't from the neighborhood, and in a store like mine, a new face stands out like a stain on a white tablecloth. She was around 30-something. Dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and wearing jeans and a leather jacket that screamed expensive from 1,000 miles away. She moved with an almost feline confidence, without hesitation, straight to the coffee aisle. I was behind the worn wooden counter, fighting with some electric bills, with stiff hands and knuckles screaming from arthritis. Age does not forgive. It has a cruel way of slowing down your fingers while the world accelerates. The woman left a package of dark roast ground coffee and a small jar of cinnamon sticks on the counter. Nothing else. Is that all, miss? I asked, forcing a kindness I didn't feel. Yes, she replied. Her voice was cutting, dry as dust. She wasn't rude, but distant, as if she wanted to finish the transaction as soon as possible. She handed me a $20 bill without looking up from the counter, avoiding any eye contact. Here is your change. 17.40, I said while counting the coins. She took them with a quick gesture and turned around. It should have ended there. I should have gone back to my bills. But when she passed by me to leave, something pulled at an invisible thread in my memory. Her way of walking, the line of her jaw, that profile, something familiar that escaped me, like a name you have on the tip of your tongue and can't manage to pronounce. Hey, excuse me. I called her before she crossed the threshold. She stopped dead and looked at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were dark, almost impenetrable. Do we know each other? Are you from around here? Her expression remained unperturbed, like a mask. I don't think so, sir. I'm not from the city. It's just that you remind me a lot of someone, an acquaintance from years ago. I get that often. I have a common face, she replied with a frozen half-smile. She pushed the door, and the jingling of the bell announced her exit. I stood there with the dust cloth in my hand, trying to place that face in some old photograph or in some memory of the neighborhood. 20 minutes later, I went out to the sidewalk to place the sign for the produce offer of the day. It was then that my heart skipped a beat. Across the street, next to a badly parked silver sedan, I saw her again, and she was not alone. Scott was there standing in front of her. They were talking. My son-in-law was leaning against the car body, relaxed, with a hand in his pocket and a smile of satisfaction that I hadn't seen on him since before Anna's death. She said something that amused him, and he let out a genuine laugh. Then, with a familiarity that churned my stomach, she touched his arm briefly, almost a caress, and got into the driver's seat. Scott went around the car and sat in the passenger seat. I stood petrified in the middle of the sidewalk with the sales sign in my hands, watching as the car drove away toward Main Street. The questions began to hit my head like hammer blows. Who was that woman? Why was she meeting with Scott right in front of my store if, according to him, he was at the office? Why had he never mentioned to me that he had such a close relationship with someone? I entered the store and locked the door from the inside, something I never did before lunch hour. I sat on the stool, surrounded by the smell of cheese and sawdust, and suddenly the aroma of coffee and cinnamon hit me. It was a strange combination. Anna always said that coffee without cinnamon wasn't coffee. It was her trademark. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Mia's voice resonated again in the silence of the premises. Watch him. I had watched, and what I had seen made no sense. Scott had never mentioned any woman, not even a friend. So, who was she and why were they hiding in broad daylight? I took out my old cell phone with trembling hands. Robert Stein had been my best friend for 40 years. We met at the school gate when our daughters were small. Robert had been a detective for the police department for 3 decades before retiring. He knew how to read between the lines. He knew how to find the rot where others only saw normality. I hadn't wanted to bother him until now. I didn't want to seem like a paranoid old man chasing ghosts because of a comment from a 7-year-old girl. But now there was that woman who bought coffee and cinnamon as if she were a ghost from the past. I looked for Robert's contact and typed with difficulty. I need your help, Bob. Stop by the store as soon as you can. It's urgent. His reply arrived in 2 minutes. I'm on my way. Put the coffee pot on. I left the phone on the counter and looked around. The shelves full of canned goods, the old scale, the bags of flour, everything seemed the same scenery as always. But deep in my gut, where the survival instinct of someone who has been through tough times still lives, I knew something was rotten, and I feared the smell was coming directly from my son-in-law's house. Robert Stein crossed the threshold of Miller's Market exactly 23 minutes after my message. Despite his 67 years, he retained that bearing of an old-school detective. Gray crew-cut hair, straight jeans, and a flannel shirt ironed with military rigor. He moved with an enviable economy of movement, that of a man who has spent 3 decades pounding the streets and dealing with the worst of every precinct. You look like you've seen a ghost, Frank, he blurted out by way of greeting, bluntly. Thanks, Bob. You're always so subtle, I replied with a bitter smile. He took a look at the premises that at that hour usually was in full bustle. You closed early. I locked up and turned the sign. We need to talk without Mrs. Thompson interrupting me to ask about the price of saffron. Robert sat on one of the high stools next to the counter, where I usually drink my mid-morning coffee. What is happening? I didn't know very well how to break the ice, so I started at the beginning. Because of Mia, I recounted in detail our afternoon in the park, the whisper under the oak tree, the trembling of her hands, and that liquid fear in her eyes when she asked me to stop feeding her father's bank account. Watch him. Robert didn't interrupt me a single time. He simply took out his inseparable pocket notebook and started scribbling with a worn pen. He had that work mode look he used to have when he was leading an investigation at the precinct. Then I moved on to what happened that same morning. The woman in the leather jacket, the aroma of coffee and cinnamon that seemed like a slap from the past, and that furtive meeting with Scott around the corner. "Did you manage to see the car's license plate?" asked Robert without looking up from the paper. "No." I stood there like a statue. I didn't expect it. Vehicle model? A silver sedan. One of those modern ones with tinted rear windows. I didn't notice more. "Bob." My legs failed me. He made another quick note. "Let's talk about the woman. Height, weight, any feature that stands out. Scars, tattoos, way of walking. 5 feet 7 inches more or less, very thin, wiry. Dark hair in a tight ponytail. About 30-something. And that brown leather jacket with gold zippers. It looked like expensive clothes, the kind you don't buy at the outlet mall. And you said she reminded you of someone. Think hard, Frank. Memories aren't whims, they are poorly stored files. It's just a feeling, a shadow in my head. I can't put a name to it." Robert tapped the pen rhythmically against the wood of the counter. "So Scott has never spoken to you about any partner nor any special friend who wears designer jackets. But he has been asking you for $30,000 annually and up to $45,000 when he could for 7 years. It's for Mia." I jumped to the defensive almost by instinct. "The money is so the girl lacks nothing. For her school, her future. Of course, Frank. For the girl." Robert's tone was neutral, but his eyes said otherwise. "Tell me something. When was the last time Scott showed you a breakdown of expenses? A receipt from the private school? An invoice for extracurricular activities?" I opened my mouth to reply and went mute. Reality hit me with the force of a freight train. I had no answers. Scott had never given me explanations. He accepted the transfers every January with a "Thanks, Dad. Anna would be proud." And I, blinded by grief and the guilt of still being alive, never dared to ask. "He is raising a daughter alone," I insisted, although my voice sounded weak even to me. I wanted to trust him for the sake of the family. Robert closed the notebook with a sharp snap. "Frank, for a 7-year-old girl to tell her grandfather to stop giving money to her father and to spy on him is not a childish tantrum. It is a distress signal. Something smells rotten in that townhouse." I let myself fall onto the counter, hiding my face in my hands. "I know what you want me to do," continued Robert, softening his tone a bit. "You want me to unwrap my old toys? Are you aware of what that means? If he catches us, there will be no turning back. I need to know if my granddaughter is in danger, if Scott has gotten into some mess, or if he is spending the sweat of my brow on who knows what." Robert leaned back and sighed. "We will start with the basics. I still keep some surveillance equipment from my time on the force. Long-distance cameras and mics. Tomorrow morning, we will set up guard near his house. We will watch who enters, who leaves. And above all, if that cinnamon woman appears again. We will track his routine until we know how many times he breathes per minute. And if we find nothing, it will mean that Mia is just going through a difficult phase, and you can go back to sleeping peacefully." But Robert looked at me over his reading glasses with a gravity that froze my blood. "I have been smelling lies for many years, Frank. And my instinct tells me that tomorrow we are not going to be bored. What time do we start?" "At 6 in the morning, I'll pick you up with the car. Wear dark clothes and bring coffee in a thermos. Real coffee, not instant." Robert headed to the door, and before leaving, he stopped with his hand on the knob. "Frank, don't feel bad about this. Protecting a child is the only law that matters, even if you have to skip the rules of courtesy with your son-in-law, especially if it is with him." He left, and the jingling of the bell vibrated in the stagnant air of the store. I stood alone, surrounded by bags of flour and tin cans, feeling that I had just crossed a point of no return. Tomorrow I would start hunting the truth, and something told me that I wasn't going to like what I was going to find on the other side of the viewfinder. That night, before attempting a rest I knew was impossible, I spread 7 years of bank statements on the kitchen table. Under the yellowish light of the lamp, the number 300,000 kept hitting my temples like a mallet. It wasn't about the money itself. The grocery store had always provided a good living, and Helen and I, like good children of the working class, had been saving ants. It was about the magnitude of the betrayal. It represented 7 years of sacred promises, 7 years of sweat, and early mornings to honor the memory of a daughter by taking care of her family. What if her family didn't need to be taken care of? What if they had been feeding on my pain like parasites? I stayed in the living room with my gaze fixed on the brass urn that presided over the fireplace. Coffee and cinnamon, two mundane items that had ignited a spark of suspicion. I spent the whole afternoon trying to decipher why that combination churned my stomach so much. And there, in the gloom, while the wall clock marked the hours with a cruel indifference, I finally understood. My eyes jumped from the urn to the framed photo next to it. Anna, Helen, and I at Clearwater Lake. We were soaked, laughing in front of a barbecue, with the August sun burning our faces. "I'm sorry, Helen," I whispered to the image of my wife. I should have had the courage to look much sooner. I had avoided touching that urn for 7 years. I told myself it was out of respect, because I couldn't let her go. But perhaps the truth was more bitter. Perhaps a part of my instinct knew, even then, that the narrative of the accident was too perfect, too closed. I reached out and took the urn. It was heavier than I remembered. The lid was sealed with a simple manual thread, without wax seals or official engravings. For a long minute, I just held it against my chest, feeling the cold metal. I remembered Helen sobbing in this same corner. I remembered the funeral, the sealed casket we could never see, and Scott's face, which always seemed to me of a suspicious neutrality, as if he were performing a rehearsed role. I took the urn to the kitchen table, placing it under the direct light of the fixtures. My hands were trembling so much that the store keys jingled in my pocket. "Forgive me, Anna, if I am wrong," I whispered with a thread of a voice. I started to turn the lid. The thread gave way with a small metallic squeak that sounded like a scream in the silence of the house. I expected to find gray ashes, bone fragments, the final residue of a life blinded at 30 years old. Instead of that, I saw something dark with a granular texture. I put my fingers in, my heart racing, and took out a handful. It wasn't ashes. It was ground coffee mixed with cinnamon powder. I stared at my palms stained brown with that sweet and bitter aroma permeating the kitchen air in an almost obscene way. There was no trace of death. There were no human remains, only remains from a supermarket. The emptiness I felt was worse than the day of the accident. It was the emptiness of having been scammed in the most sacred way. At that moment, the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was a message from Robert. "Frank, I have been reviewing the recordings from the cameras we installed this afternoon. You have to see this right now. Come to my house now." I drove through the deserted streets of the city like a possessed man, running yellow lights with my hands still stained with that cursed coffee. Robert was waiting for me in his home office, a suffocating room full of monitors and folders of old cases. "Look at this," he said without preamble, pointing to a screen. It was the entrance to Scott's townhouse. It marked 8 in the evening. The silver sedan parked in front of the house. The woman in the leather jacket got out of the car, but this time she didn't head to the front door. Scott came out to the porch, looked nervously to both sides of the street, and with a quick gesture guided her toward the garage. Robert pressed a key and the image changed. It was a shot from the rear captured by a high-resolution camera placed strategically. "I managed access to the angle from the neighbor's house," explained Robert with a professional voice, although his eyes shone with rage. "Look at the window on the upper floor. The master bedroom." The image was digitally enlarged. The woman was there under the warm light of the bedside lamps. She was taking off the leather jacket with slow gestures. Scott entered the frame and hugged her from behind, burying his face in her neck. Both were laughing. Then she turned and gave him a long kiss, deep, with a passion that admits no doubts. The light was clear, without shadows. She let down her ponytail, and her dark hair fell over her shoulders. The air escaped from my lungs as if I had been punched. I had to grab the edge of Robert's table to keep from collapsing on the floor. "No, it can't be," I whispered with tears clouding my vision. "Frank, I am truly sorry," said Robert, putting a hand on my shoulder. "That is not just any woman, Bob. Look at her well." Robert frowned and approached the monitor, adjusting his reading glasses. "It's Anna," I said, and my voice broke into a heartbreaking sob that had been contained for 7 years. "My daughter is not dead. My daughter is alive and has been stealing my life." The world seemed to have tilted on its axis, leaving me suspended in an unbearable void. Anna was alive. My daughter, the apple of my eye for whom I had cried every night for 7 winters, whom I believed reduced to that coffee with cinnamon in the urn, was right there on that grainy screen. She was smiling and kissing the man who had been extorting me, stealing $30,000 a year and every cent he could extract from me with emotional blackmail for an absence he himself had manufactured. "We have to go there right now, Bob," I said, standing up with a strength I didn't know I had left. "Call the station, have them send patrols. That bastard has my daughter." "Calm down, Frank. Sit down." Robert put a firm hand on my shoulder using that command voice that deactivates panic. "If we go in now like a bull in a china shop, they could flee. Or worse, Scott could do something crazy. We have to understand the how and the why. Why would Anna hide? How is it possible that no one noticed?" We spent the rest of the night dissecting the web of lies. Robert, pulling his strings and waking up old contacts and records in the medical examiner's office, discovered the macabre truth. The accident on the interstate was real, but the victim was not my daughter, it was Natalie, her best friend from college. The fire was so intense that visual identification was impossible. Scott, as spouse and only direct contact, was in charge of confirming the identity. To ensure the deception, he used falsified dental records that someone, probably under bribery, provided him. "But why Natalie?" I asked, feeling nausea burning my throat. "Natalie was an orphan and had no siblings, Frank," explained Robert with a hardened gaze. "No one missed her at first. And by the time some distant cousin started asking, Scott had already collected the life insurance, had sold the car, and you had already started sending him the money from the grocery store. He had created a perfect ghost." What we discovered next, thanks to a directional microphone that Robert installed in a garden hedge the next day, was even more sinister. Anna was not a happy accomplice enjoying the loot. We heard an argument that froze my blood. Scott had her subjected through psychological terror. He had made her believe that she was the guilty one in the accident due to a supposed distraction at the wheel, and that if the truth came to light, she would spend the rest of her life in prison for the death of her best friend. He kept her captive in her own house, allowing her to leave only on counted occasions, always under his surveillance or following strict routes. Mia, my little and brave Mia, knew everything. She saw how her father controlled, humiliated, and scared her mother every day behind the lowered blinds. That's why she had that fear in her eyes. That's why she asked me to cut the flow of money. She knew the bills were the bars of her mother's cell. The following Friday, at dawn, the silence of the street was broken forever. With the help of Robert and an operational team of his former colleagues from the police force, we mounted the assault. We didn't just want to rescue. We wanted Scott to pay for every cent stolen, for every tear of Mia's, and for the 7 years of false mourning that had aged my soul. The crash of the battering ram bursting the front door was the sweetest and most liberating sound I have heard in my whole life. Scott tried to escape through the kitchen, but Robert intercepted him in the hallway, slammed him against the wall, and handcuffed him with a professional skill, one that only a true friend allows himself to exercise when honor is at stake. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the pain in my knees. In the master bedroom, Anna was huddled in a corner, covering her ears and trembling like a leaf. When she saw me enter, her eyes opened wide, losing that mask of coldness I saw in the store. She was no longer the woman in the leather jacket. They were the eyes of my lost girl, rescued from a shipwreck of 7 years. "Dad?" she whispered with a voice broken by disuse. I held her in my arms with such force that I feared breaking her, and I cried. I cried for Helen, who couldn't see this moment. I cried for the lost years and for the recovered freedom. "You are safe, daughter. The nightmare is over. Let's go home." As I left, I saw Mia in the front yard, guarded by an officer. She looked at me, and for the first time her smile was not a shadow of Anna's, but a light of her own, pure and brave. Scott was put in the squad car amidst the boos of the neighbors who were beginning to wake up. As the sun finished rising over the city, I knew that Miller's Market would have new owners soon. I was going to dedicate myself to recovering minute by minute the 7 years they had stolen from us. Comment. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is question the people we love most. Your gut instinct is a powerful guide, and it is rarely wrong, even when your heart wants to ignore it. Setting boundaries is not selfish, but a necessary act of self-preservation. Real generosity is not just giving resources away, but making sure those resources are actually building a safe future. We can learn so much from the courage it takes to speak up when something feels heavy or wrong. Even though we cannot change the past or recover lost time, we still have the power to reclaim our narrative today. Healing begins the moment we choose to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Please remember, it is never too late to fight for your peace and protect the people who depend on you. I hope you find the strength to trust your own voice and choose a path that brings you genuine light. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.